Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the world of the Gospels, part 7, in our continuing study of the life of Christ. I want to talk first about the Jewish family life. The family was so very important. And you think, well, all families are important in every culture. No, there are some cultures in which the family is much more centered. And in this case, it would be centered around what we call the pater familias, that is, the father of the family. The Jewish families were focused and took their leadership from the father, not just the father of the little children, but even the father of adult children. Now, this was true in Jewish families. This was also true in Roman families, even though Romans and Jewish people were very different. Among the Jewish people, they took this from the fifth commandment: honor your father and mother. And when they heard that, they thought, honor your father and mother. The mother was honored too, but the father was honored in such a way that he was obeyed. In fact, the way they would often live are what we call insulas. Now, an insula is a grouping of homes that are family oriented, so that when mom and dad have children and those children grow up and become adults, instead of moving out to a different location, a son might take a bride, might take a wife, and what would he do? He would build onto his parents' place, and so he would build an addition, and he and his new wife would move into that addition, and they would live as part of that larger household. Think about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, uh, and of course Joseph has an issue where he's sold into slavery. But the children of Jacob, they're still living with dad, even though they have their own wives and children, and their children have children. They are all living together. Now, this was a very Jewish thing. Circumcision also was the sign of their Jewishness. It was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, a very personal sign. You didn't go showing this off to other people, but it was the sign that was placed upon every newborn, 8 days old, and a child would be circumcised and given his name at that time. So circumcision took place on the 8th day, and of course, we actually have the reference to both John the Baptist and Jesus being circumcised. This is where the name would be given, and names were very significant. Sometimes they were considered prophetic, sometimes a quality, a memorial, sometimes named after somebody who had been very important. And next, we have the Jewish education. Of course, the education begins in the home. Begins with mother and father, initially perhaps mother, because she's the one that's taking care of the little one. But as soon as he's able, this child is going to be with his father and learning the same trade as his father, being taught as his father by the father. And by the time we get to the first century, something new had taken place where children were being taught in the synagogue. They were being taught to read and write. Now, not every Jewish child could read and write, but the Jewish people had a much higher level of literacy than I'm going to suggest than any ancient culture up to that time. So a much higher degree of literacy. Now that doesn't mean that they all had a college education, no, but a great many of them had a basic education. And think about this: this was going to be brought about in one sense because the Jewish people are coming together each week on the Sabbath. They're coming to a synagogue where they will hear the scriptures read to them, and if they're able to read, they will participate in that reading. Now, there aren't a lot of books around, so most people who throughout the ancient world, they might go their whole lives and never see a book. But if you're Jewish and went to a synagogue, you're going to see a book there. It's a copy of the scriptures that would be hand copied, and it would be that synagogue's most treasured possession. Next, I want to talk about marriage. Monogamy was normal in the first century. Now, we go back to Old Testament times, we see a number of cases where people had more than one wife. That was going out of style. It had not completely disappeared. For example, you have Herod the Great. Herod the Great had, I think somebody counted around 10 wives, and some of those were at the same time. So he is practicing polygamy. And I'm sure there were other examples of that, but both among the Jews and especially among the Romans, that had gone out of style. And even among the Jews, that wasn't quite so normal anymore. Marriages were oftentimes arranged. Oftentimes, the wealthier you were, the more likely it was to be an arranged marriage, because marriage was not just a romantic, "Gee, I love you, so I want to marry you." Rather, it was a societal norm, that is, a norm of society that was brought about in order to bring about families. There would be a betrothal where a man and a woman would be promised to each other, and technically, this is a little bit like being engaged, but it was actually stronger than engagement, because when somebody gets engaged, they can say, "Okay, we're going to get married," and then one party gets upset with the other party, and they call it off, and that's it. We're not going to get married. In a betrothal, it took a divorce to break them apart. So, in a sense, they were legally married, but the marriage had not been physically consummated as of yet. There was also the reason people got married back then was to provide a core for the family. And so I'm not saying divorce never took place. Divorce actually did take place. And you have people like Josephus. Josephus talked about how he had been married and divorced quite a few times. But still, most people who became married, a great many of them stayed married, even though they were arranged marriages. And the wedding would be a very big deal. Now, in the wedding, it was we go to a wedding and we see the exchange of vows. The vows had actually been exchanged at the betrothal. You say, well, what do you do at the wedding? Well, it was all about the party and the honeymoon. And so it was really the reception slash honeymoon, and it might go on not just for a single day. It might go on for several days. For those that were wealthier, it might go on for an entire week. As I said, there were divorces that took place, and when it came to divorce, there were two major Jewish ideas. One was the school of Shammai that said a divorce is proper only for unfaithfulness. That is, if the two parties have not been unfaithful to each other, then you should never get divorced. And then, uh, in contrast to that, there was the school of Hillel that said it's okay to get divorced for any reason as long as you go about the proper ritual for divorce. And the proper ritual for divorce was to take something in writing, either of course, paper. People didn't have a lot of paper, so you might take it on a piece of broken pot, known as an ostraca, and you would take this piece of pot and you would write on it, and if you couldn't write yourself, then you'd have somebody write on it for you. I, Joseph, and am divorcing you, Anna. And you put your name and the wife's name, and this is officially now a divorce, and you hand it to her, and that constituted the divorce. And the school of Hillel said, which Josephus evidently was from that school, because he talks about how he had married somebody and she displeased him, so he said, "Oh, I don't want to be married to you." Gave her a certificate of divorce. Now he's divorced. He married somebody else, and a third. I think he went through at least three marriages that I know of. The Jewish family was all about the responsibilities that had been taken. And of course, one of the things that they had was adoption. But in our culture, adoption is about taking care of the children. In a Jewish culture and Roman culture too, Romans had adoption as well. Adoption was to bring the child into the family so that as the child grew up, the child would be able to care for the parents as they got older. They didn't have things like Social Security and nursing homes and things like that. Instead, it was expected that the child, whether the natural child or the adopted child, if the family had no natural children, perhaps they hadn't been able to have children, or perhaps it was a case where the adult children had died. That could happen, where a disease had taken its toll. And so they would adopt somebody, and they could adopt a little child, or they could even adopt a full-grown man whose responsibility would now be to take care of those parents, and then he would receive the inheritance. He would receive all that they owned once they had died. And so that was adoption. But you also had the firstborn in a family that had multiple children. The firstborn had the responsibility to care for the entire family, and because of that, the firstborn would be given a firstborn inheritance. He would be given either a double portion or a greater portion. Uh, I say double. Sometimes I suppose it might be even more than that. The firstborn would be given the lion's share of the inheritance, but it was also his responsibility to make sure everyone else was cared for so that he would be the new head of the home once father had died. Next, I want to talk, very different topic, the difference between the temple and the synagogue. Now, there was only one Jewish temple, or I should say there was supposed to be only one Jewish temple. The reason I say it that way is because we've actually found examples of these were before New Testament times, but of some Jewish temples in other places. There's one down in southern Egypt at a place called the Island of the Elephants, at Elephantine Island. There was a Jewish temple there. I don't know what it was doing there, why it was there, but some Jewish people had built their own temple, probably because they were in exile and there was perhaps no temple back in Israel at the time where they built it. Don't know exactly when it was built, but around that time. Um, so there was only one Jewish temple, but there were many synagogues, and it was when the temple was first destroyed in the days of Nebuchadnezzar that the synagogue had come about. It had come about because the Jewish people said, "How are we going to worship God if the place where we're supposed to worship God is no longer there? It had been destroyed." And so the idea of a coming together place, and the way you say coming together place is the Greek term synagogue, or we say synagogue. And the idea is where you had a place where there were at least 10 Jewish men. They would come together, and perhaps they started in people's homes, but eventually the idea of purchasing and building a location where you would have an actual meeting place. What you're seeing in the bottom is the synagogue at Capernaum, but we've found synagogues, ruins of synagogues, ancient synagogues, in a number of different places, and they were all throughout the ancient world. Anytime you had a Jewish community of at least 10 men, you had enough to have a synagogue. Now, the first century synagogue, and I'm standing here in a replica, a reproduction. This one happens to be in Nazareth. Like I said, you had to have 10 men. They would meet together on the Sabbath day, different times, I suppose, and they'd talk about the different times, but usually sometime that day they'd have a meeting. The times varied. Both men and women would come together for the meeting. They would both be present. They would read from the scriptures, although it was men that normally did the reading. As a rule, they were the ones that were permitted to read aloud. Oh, I should talk about reading aloud too, because the idea of reading to yourself, oftentimes I'll pick up a book or an iPad or something like that, and I'll read quietly to myself. That was very non-Jewish. Actually, it was very non-ancient world. In the ancient world, it was the customary practice to read out loud because they were a very oral tradition, a very oral people. And so only the men usually were the ones that were reading the scriptures. And of course, all copies of the scriptures were handwritten. So that made it very, very labor intensive to produce one, made it very valuable. Then there would be a time of questions and answers. And if you'll remember that First Corinthians chapter, um, let's see, I'm sorry, chapter 14. I blanked out for a second. Um, Talked about, is it appropriate for everybody to ask questions, or maybe the men ought to be asking the questions and the women, asking their husbands at home. But there would be a period of questions and answers, and this was in the synagogue, and later on, this practice was adopted also by the church.